Well, last night, Donald Trump went from being a lame duck to being a humiliated duck when voters from coast to coast turned out to vote against Donald Trump and his candidates and his policies in every place and in every way that they could. Donald Trump's explanation today for the Republican wipeout last night is that Donald Trump was not on the ballot. That's what he says. The conservative Wall Street Journal editorial board has written a reply to that under the headline, "Trump really was on the ballot." The Journal editorial says Mr. Trump was on the ballot, not literally, but nonetheless, as the main motivating force behind a dominating Democratic turnout. Winning Democratic candidates for governor in New Jersey and Virginia linked their opponents to Mr. Trump, driving Democratic voters to the polls and erasing the GOP gains in 2024 among Hispanics, Black men, and independents. The result was a much bigger Democratic triumph than polls predicted. The tsunami was big enough that Democrats were able to pick up 13 seats in the Virginia House of Delegates. They'll have 64 seats out of 100, which could give Democrats the chance to redistrict next year to gain congressional seats. And in California, where not a single name was on the ballot, voters stood in long lines to deliver 63% support for Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom's proposal for congressional redistricting in California that could add 4 or 5 seats for the Democrats to the House of Representatives and win control of the House of Representatives for the Democrats in next year's election. Every one of those California votes for that proposition was a vote against Donald Trump, every one of them. The reason no previous president has ever considered pursuing any of the policies Donald Trump has pursued this year is that those policies are obviously politically suicidal. And now we have the proof of that. And Donald Trump's bright idea today, during his politically suicidal government shutdown, is to partially shut down the air traffic control system in this country with the Thanksgiving travel surge approaching. Every day, Donald Trump finds a new way to weaken himself and weaken his party politically while making life in this country worse for millions of Americans. And now he wants to make it much worse for the millions of Americans who hope to go home for Thanksgiving this year. With less than a year into his presidency this time, Donald Trump is now the lamest of lame ducks ever to occupy the presidency. And sinking with him is the lamest group of Republican members of the House and Senate that the country has ever seen. The election returns last night indicate that a year from now, Democrats will win back control of the House of Representatives, and Donald Trump's administration and his incompetent cabinet members will be subject to real investigations of their personal profiteering from government, real investigations of possible abuse of their office, real investigations of an FBI director who uses a government plane for date night. Democratic control of the House of Representatives means that most of the Trump madness can be stopped and in its tracks. And Donald Trump knows that. And so Donald Trump is living in fear tonight of just how bad election night is going to be for him next year. And just 12 hours after Donald Trump's electoral humiliation last night, in the United States Supreme Court this morning, Donald Trump was humiliated again when the Supreme Court, including the justices who Donald Trump appointed, ripped apart the biggest and stupidest policy lie of the Trump second term. At 11:22 a.m., when Neil Katyal rose to address the Supreme Court, the first sentence he spoke contained only 3 words: tariffs are taxes. And there it was, the pure economic truth and policy truth about tariffs that the founders of this government knew and that every president has known and every member of Congress has known until Donald Trump started lying about tariffs. The Trump tariff enforcers were seated in the front row at the Supreme Court today. Why? To try to intimidate the Supreme Court? The always goofy Howard Lutnick, the most incompetent Commerce Secretary in history, who is always the loudest laugh at every Trump joke, was there in the front row, bringing into the room a mind smaller than the smallest mind on the Supreme Court. And sitting beside him was the Secretary of the Treasury. In our lifetimes, the Secretary of the Treasury has never attended a Supreme Court hearing. The last Secretary of the Treasury known to have attended a Supreme Court hearing was the first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. But that was in 1796. Hamilton attended a Supreme Court hearing only when he was a former Secretary of the Treasury, the year that he attended that hearing. And so it is entirely possible that no currently serving Secretary of the Treasury has ever attended a Supreme Court hearing until the relentlessly ineffectual Scott Bessent, who appears to believe that the most important thing about being a Treasury Secretary is dressing the part, while being willing to say the most ridiculously false things ever said about tariffs by a Treasury Secretary. Donald Trump himself had been threatening to attend the Supreme Court hearing, presumably as some kind of intimidation tactic. But he chose in the end to send his completely unintimidating court jesters instead. Donald Trump's lawyer, arguing in favor of his illegal and unconstitutional tariffs today, had a much more difficult time than the Trump tariff enablers do when they appear in very friendly TV interviews that they submit to. The Treasury Secretary and the Commerce Secretary have an open invitation to come on this program and discuss tariffs for the full hour or any amount of time that they choose. But they haven't shown up. Today, they had to sit there silently when Neil Katyal said tariffs are taxes. And they had to sit there silently for all 2 hours and 40 minutes in which Donald Trump's lawyer never said that tariffs are not taxes. He didn't try to make that impossible point. It was simply an accepted fact of the case by all of the justices. Tariffs are taxes. 3 minutes after Neil Katyal's first sentence saying tariffs are taxes, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court said, quote, "The tariffs are a tax," end quote. That is how fully accepted that fact was during this argument. Chief Justice Roberts said, yes, sure, the tariffs are a tax, and that's a core power of Congress. Yes, sure. Not a single Supreme Court justice disagreed with the chief or Neil Katyal about that. Tariffs are taxes is the single shortest sentence that exposes the lie of the Trump tariffs, which Donald Trump has claimed are paid by foreign countries. Donald Trump's lawyer, the Solicitor General, didn't dare try to tell that lie to the Supreme Court today. Donald Trump's lawyer could not refute one word of Neil Katyal's exquisite opening 4 sentences in his brilliant argument today.
Tariffs are taxes. They take dollars from Americans' pockets and deposit them in the U.S. Treasury. Our founders gave that taxing power to Congress alone. Yet here, the president bypassed Congress and imposed one of the largest tax increases in our lifetimes.
Dollars from Americans' pockets. This is what Donald Trump has done. He has imposed one of the largest tax increases in our lifetimes by stealing a power that the founders explicitly gave to Congress alone. Not one word of that was disputed in any way before the Supreme Court today. Chief Justice Roberts made it very clear who pays the Trump tariffs in his first questions to Donald Trump's Solicitor General. Chief Justice Roberts said this about the Trump tariffs, quote, "The vehicle is imposition of taxes on Americans, and that has always been the core power of Congress." The Supreme Court has spoken. Americans pay the Trump tariffs. Justice Sotomayor interrupted Donald Trump's Solicitor General early in his argument with a line a lawyer never wants to hear from a Supreme Court justice: "I just don't understand this argument."
I just don't understand this argument. It's not an article. It's a congressional power, not a presidential power to tax. And you want to say tariffs are not taxes, but that's exactly what they are. They're generating money from American citizens, revenue. And you say it's incidental to the regulatory purpose. But I don't see how a quota is equivalent to revenue raising. A quota sets a limit to what you can import in, but it doesn't generate revenue.
There were no sharp disagreements among the justices. Not a single justice disagreed with Justice Sotomayor's statement that tariffs are paid by American citizens. The Solicitor General tried to argue that a federal law that gives the president an emergency authority to regulate some aspects of international trade gives Donald Trump unlimited power to impose tariffs. Justice Sotomayor pointed out that Congress never uses the word regulate to mean tax. And Neil Katyal made this point about the word regulate.
The word regulate is words regulate importation. The word regulate has never been used. The Congress uses the term 1,499 times. We got about that number of hits when we looked at it. And maybe there's some double counting, but it is never used even once to impose taxes or revenue raising.
The Trump-appointed Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch showed how a newly invented presidential tariff power could become a nightmare scenario for Republicans.
Could the president impose a 50% tariff on gas-powered cars and auto parts to deal with the unusual and extraordinary threat from abroad of climate change?
It's very likely that can be done. That's very likely.
I think that has to be the logic of your view.
Yeah.
Yes, that is the logic of his view. That is exactly what the Trump argument is. And in her final comments to the Solicitor General of Oregon, who was also arguing against the tariffs today, Justice Sonia Sotomayor emphasized why the power to raise revenue through tariffs and taxes was deliberately given to Congress by the authors of the Constitution.
That's a good point. I think what we're forgetting here is a very fundamental point, which is the Constitution is structured so that if I'm going to be asked to pay for something as a citizen, that it's through a bill that is generated through Congress and the president has the power to veto it or not. But I'm not going to be taxed unless both houses, the executive and the legislature, have made that choice, correct?
That's exactly right.
That is exactly right. And it was a very bad day for the lame duck, Donald Trump, now the humiliated duck, Donald Trump, at the United States Supreme Court.
Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Democrats have not had a night like last night in a long time. And the message sent to Donald Trump and the Republican Party and to the entire political world was loud and clear if anyone cares to listen. These infographics from the New York Times, they've become familiar. They run these often, right? Comparing voting trends from last year's presidential election to last night. And it's a map, right? You see both the states, New Jersey, Virginia, county by county by county. Every blue arrow you see on that map there is an area that voted more for the Democrats than it did just last year. And as you can see, it's basically all blue arrows, like all throughout the state. Because last night, everything shifted towards the Democrats and away from Donald Trump. They swept practically every single race up and down the ballot across the country. The Democratic roll began with an early call in Virginia, where Democrat Abigail Spanberger is winning by 15 points. The last Democrat to win a Virginia gubernatorial election in similar circumstances, Donald Trump was in office at that point, was Ralph Northam, who won back in 2017 by just 9 points. Democrat handily won the lieutenant governor's race there as well. Ghazala Hashmi, the first Muslim woman elected statewide anywhere in the United States, by more than 10 points. In the state attorney general race, this actually, political observers have been watching this one closely, right? Because Democrat Jay Jones managed to edge out a victory, and not really even edge out, like a 5-point win's a 5-point win, in the midst of a text message scandal that was pretty bad. Keep in mind, Harris won Virginia by 6 points, right? So he's almost running even with her after an absolutely brutal campaign. That's the top of the ticket. Further down the ballot, in some senses, an even more amazing result. Democrats picked up 13 seats in the Virginia House of Delegates. 13 seats. In one night, the House of Delegates goes from essentially almost a 50-50 split, narrow majority, to basically a Democratic supermajority. And again, if you do not think any of this was about the guy who's in the White House, the guy who just knocked down the East Wing, Donald Trump, well, here's the Speaker of the Virginia House.
The thing I love about Virginia, we have a motto. It's sic semper tyrannis, thus always the tyrants. We don't like kings in Virginia. And tonight we stood up and we showed them that we would not continue to accept the direction that the country was going. We got to send the first love letter to the rest of the country. You know, Virginia's for lovers. We got to send the first love letter to the country to say we have not all lost our dang old minds and we're ready to move in a different direction.
In New Jersey, Democratic gubernatorial candidate Mikey Sherrill crushed her Trump-endorsed opponent in a race that basically everyone thought was pretty close. Republicans definitely thought that they had a real shot at winning.
Here in New Jersey, we know that this nation has not ever been, nor will it ever be, ruled by kings. We take oaths to a constitution, not a king. We've chosen liberty, the very foundation of democracy, and we've chosen prosperity necessary to create opportunity for all.
And then in New York City, state with a population greater than the city with a population greater than 38 states, the left wing of the modern Democratic Party had arguably its biggest victory ever. 34-year-old Democratic socialist Zohran Mamdani won the race to be mayor of New York. Mamdani won an outright majority of the vote, meaning he, even if he was running as one person, right, he's got a majority, in a three-way race in which he was really smeared with attacks on his Ugandan heritage and his Muslim faith and just about everything in between. He defeated Andrew Cuomo, who had been, down the stretch, endorsed by both Donald Trump and Stephen Miller.
New York will remain a city of immigrants, a city built by immigrants, powered by immigrants. And as of tonight, led by an immigrant. So hear me, President Trump, when I say this. To get to any of us, you will have to get through all of us.
Now, those are the three top marquee races, right? Those are the big ones every year. They're the three races that happen every year, 1 year after the presidential. So Virginia governor, New Jersey governor, New York City mayor. But that, honestly, is just the tip of the iceberg, because across the country, it was just a total blowout for Democrats, like a 10 out of 10 kind of night. In California, voters there turned out in droves just so they could support Governor Gavin Newsom's ballot initiative, which would allow the state to redraw its congressional maps in order to combat Republican gerrymandering, particularly in Texas. That measure, which again was on the ballot in a year when California doesn't have elections, they don't have really off-year elections, it was a special election, it won by 30 points. The governor of California thinks he knows why.
Donald Trump is an historic president. He is the most historically unpopular president in modern history. In every critical category, Donald Trump is underwater.
In Pennsylvania, right, a crucial swing state, a swing state that Donald Trump carried a year ago, the state voted to retain all three of its Democratic Supreme Court justices after Republicans, and one particular rich dude, spent millions upon millions of dollars in a normally sleepy race, hoping to be able to get control of that court to possibly muck around with future election results in the state. In Bellwether, Erie County, one of those counties that election nerds are always looking at, a Democrat ousted an incumbent Republican for a county executive seat. Down south, in deep, deep red Mississippi, Democrats flipped 2 seats in the Mississippi State Senate, where they broke the Republican supermajority there. They also appeared to have flipped a state House seat. 2 Democrats won seats on the Georgia Public Service Commission, which, again, sort of a sleepy office, but that's a statewide election, okay? This is the first time, listen to this, Democrats have won statewide in Georgia in a non-federal race, meaning not Senate races, in almost 20 years. And I could go on and on. We could get super granular. I could take you through county legislative races in New York and counties in Connecticut. But just everywhere you look, when you zoom in, it's not just a normal night, right? And it wasn't just a win for the party that has more engaged voters, because we have seen Democrats overperform in special elections. No, this was something different. These were high turnout elections that delivered an absolute electoral drubbing for Donald Trump, for MAGA, and the Republican Party. Probably the closest analog I can find in the time that I've covered politics, for Democrats at least, is probably 2006, when Democrats had an enormous night and it just became clear to everyone the country was absolutely through with George W. Bush and through with the Iraq War and through with all of it, and that a major electoral backlash was brewing. Or for Republicans back in 2009, 2010, that 2009 night, right? Chris Christie winning, Bob McDonnell winning in Virginia, it said something about where the politics were. And last night says something deep about the politics of the country, because you can look at all the polls all you want, and you can read the reporting, but the voters actually have to vote, right? They get to say, in the end, that's what democracy is. And what they were saying last night is something that a lot of people in the discourse have been weirdly reluctant to come to terms with, but is staring us in the face. This is not super complicated. There's an Occam's razor solution for it. Donald Trump is unpopular. He is disliked. Donald Trump, 1 year ago, winning a single election by 1.5 percentage points, coming out of sky-high inflation, the oldest president in history, a guy who jumped off the ticket 100 days before the election, him winning that 1.5-point victory did not mean that America suddenly became right-wing forever in perpetuity. That we were now and would always be a MAGA nation, that the culture was transformed. It certainly didn't mean that Trump would continue to overperform with, for instance, young men, or overperform with voters of color, particularly Hispanic voters, as he had just a year ago. Because guess what? It's just 12 months later. And let me tell you, last night, his party decidedly did not overperform. Zohran Mamdani won young men by 40 points, according to NBC News exit polling. Spanberger and Sherrill, who are sort of normie, centrist Democratic women, right? They won young men by double digits. Donald Trump won last year. He did. That's democracy. He won narrowly with a very, very razor-thin majority in the House and a small one in the Senate, and immediately has overplayed his hand. We have tangible proof of that today. It's not polling, it's not speculation, it's not vibes. It's the real thing right in front of us. It is the first real possibility of an emperor has no clothes moment. And Republicans can ignore it to their own peril. Joining me now is Senator Elizabeth Warren, Democrat of Massachusetts. According to NBC exit polls in New Jersey, 32% of voters said the economy is the most important issue. 7% said immigration. 16% said health care. 35% taxes. Only 3% said crime. That's the sort of top line here. What is your reaction to what happened last night?
Well, woohoo! But it's you've got this right. There's a big pushback against Donald Trump. But look at the other half, and that is the message that the Democrats ran on. What Zohran ran on, what Abigail ran on, what Mikey ran on was affordability, affordability, affordability. They were out there talking about what's happening to American families right now in Donald Trump's economy, how people are smashed against the wall, and they committed that they are in the fight to turn that around, to be part of a state government, to be part of a city that says we're not here just to make government work for a handful of billionaires. We're here to make government work for working people. And a lot of people heard that and said, I'm with you on this.
How much does that message matter over and above the kind of structural backlash, right? Like, how are you thinking about this in terms of, we have this term thermostatic public opinion, right? And we've seen it for all the years that I've covered, particularly that Virginia race, right? Democrat in the White House, Republicans probably favored in that race a year later. Republican in the White House, the Democrats probably favored, right? We kind of know the way this goes. Over and above that, what did you see last night from Democrats that says what's happening is more than just the normal swings of the way the electorate works?
So I see this as how it is that someone like Mikey Sherrill, whom I like very much, but is a very different flavor than Zoran Mamdani, basically both ran on the same message. Stop and think about that for just a minute. Mikey and I were co-sponsors on the bill for universal child care. I went and campaigned with Zoran on universal child care because both of them were saying, we understand what's happening to American families. We understand how life is just not livable in a world that is all about tax breaks for billionaires and not making the investments in our families, in our children, not making investments in transportation or bringing down the cost of utilities. That these were candidates who said, I have very specific plans. I'm going to be in the fight to bring down costs for you. And what that does is that helps us really, as Democrats, get to a place where we deliver. We do things that are measurable. We're not just not Donald Trump, which, believe me, that is enough. That's enough to motivate a lot of people to go to the polls. But it's beyond that. And the point is, it's sustainable over time, Chris. It's how you build something out of New York City and out of Virginia and out of New Jersey. It's how you build something out of all parts of the country to say that we get it. The cost of utilities is up 11% since Donald Trump got into office. Cost of groceries is up. Cost of housing is up. And Republicans are deliberately trying to push the cost of health care. I mean, how do you describe it? Through the stratosphere. People are watching their health insurance rates double and triple. And what I felt last night is this kind of joining together among Democrats in how we're in this fight. I'm here in the Senate where Democrats are holding out, saying that we're not going to sign off to a Republican budget that takes away health care from tens of millions of people. We're in this fight to help get those health care costs under control, to bring them down for working families. And I think that's kind of the heart of what it means to be a Democrat.
We're reporting on this string of Democratic wins that are clearly upending politics today. The voters turned out and spoke really with one voice across the country. They spoke out and voted against Trump's unpopular second term. Democrats reaching, quote, the most important goal in politics, the New York Times reports today, showing they can win and win big. Sometimes it is that simple. Democratic candidates won decisively, double-digit victories in New Jersey and Virginia, where Dems flipped the governor's mansion, propelling a new young face in New York, showing momentum in pockets of purple and red areas, the kind of places that will decide the midterms if past precedent holds. And those midterms are, as of this week now, just 1 year away. So will these results shape what comes next? Will they bring a Democratic rejoinder to the MAGA era 1 year from this week in the midterms? And which results are about these Democratic candidates versus policy debates, which don't depend on the person? Which results are about what is clearly a growing Trump backlash, despite what you may have heard from some smug elites? And what are the other dynamics that actually occurred last night, but could be harder to replicate in the future? Let me tell you this. Right now, tonight, over the course of this hour, we will report for you and try to bring you the evidence, the numbers, the hard facts, what actually is happening to answer each of those questions on this special election post-game show tonight. We are going to build on those breaking election results that we reported out across election night, with Michael Steele joining us shortly. He's standing by to be my first guest tonight in a few moments. We begin right now, though, with a few words from the winners. Seems fitting. And how they touted that the voters rejected, quote, Kings, and how they will, quote, turn the volume up.
Here in New Jersey, we know that this nation has not ever been, nor will it ever be, ruled by kings.
We sent a message to the whole world that in 2025, Virginia chose pragmatism over partisanship.
And let me make this crystal clear. We can de facto end Donald Trump's presidency as we know it.
If anyone can show a nation betrayed by Donald Trump how to defeat him, it is the city that gave rise to him. So, Donald Trump, since I know you're watching, I have 4 words for you. Turn the volume up.
4 words, turn the volume up. Those victorious candidates speaking with the confidence of the mandates they now have for governing. Voters recoiling from Trump's extreme second-term agenda, which has been very clearly lived and seen across this year, handing Democrats the sweep, which marks the big step toward getting their groove back. That's a New York Times headline. Rupert Murdoch's Wall Street Journal reports on the clear dent in Trump's coalition, because even in blue-leaning states, as I'm about to show you, Dems also gained ground in the areas that Trump had previously excelled in. Now, politics is full of spin, but this sweep is clear enough that President Trump is not even trying to lie about the loss, as he did in 2020. Instead, the president rushing to basically put something out there, as they say. He likes to post online. He admits the shutdown hurt his Republican Party, while an RNC vet concedes there's no sugarcoating these results. They are really bad for the GOP. A nonpartisan Politico ticking through these Democratic wins: New York's first Democratic Socialist mayor, Virginia's first female governor, America's first Muslim woman elected statewide. The Republican Party, they observe, took one hell of a kicking. Politico goes on to ask, sarcastically, tired of so much winning? They note the MAGA clapback, that these were, quote, the first major election since Trump returned to the White House, and there's no other way of spinning the voters' response. Democrats outperformed expectations in every significant race across America. Now, many of the headlines and sort of the big stories, as they say, have followed some of the key races in blue areas. But the problem for the Republican Party is that this goes beyond a New York City or one blue state, quote unquote. Democrats found momentum across red states as well. They won 2 seats in Mississippi, a feat that is their best performance there in over a decade. In Georgia, the voters ousted 2 Republicans from a key local commission. A Democrat hadn't won that office since 2007. Democrats beat back efforts to oust 3 judges in a state where Trump did win, Pennsylvania. You can call it a swing state or a Trump state, but they prevailed there last night. Wherever people had a chance to vote, the Democrats won. And then you had something that was in, of course, one of the bluest states, California, but their bid to fight fire with water and douse Trump's off-year gerrymandering to rig the midterms also won decisively and was backed by a person who may want to run against Trump, California Governor Newsom. Now, these results and these calls came in quickly last night. Nicole and I were just chatting in the handoff about how you stay up late, and when we're here in the newsroom, you really don't know what's going to happen. You really do wait on the votes and the votes to be counted. We have had times where it is past 1, 2 a.m. on the East Coast, and it's a murky picture. And our job, everyone's job, is supposed to follow the evidence, not spin, and wait. But there wasn't a lot of waiting last night because it came in early and quickly because the races were not even close. The Democrats were winning quickly and decisively. And here is how some of those victories sunk in across the news coverage in real time. Our beat team collected the key moments here, and you're going to see it actually takes a minute because there were so many.
It is election night here at MSNBC.
Results are coming in that could prove to be a test of how his first 9 months in office have gone.
Democrats won 3 high-profile races.
Mamdani has done an extraordinary job in mobilizing people at the grassroots level.
The winner of the New York City mayoral race
there you go.
will be Zohran Mamdani.
Zohran Mamdani completed an improbable and rather astonishing surge.
If somebody with the views of Zohran Mamdani could ever win and be mayor of New York City, I don't think I would have believed it.
It is a good day for New York that many people have voted.
NBC News can now project that the state of Virginia will have its new governor. Its first ever female governor will be Democrat Abigail Spanberger.
Abigail is exactly the right candidate at exactly the right moment. Abigail Spanberger will be elected the governor of Virginia.
NBC News projects that the Democratic candidate, Congresswoman Mikey Sherrill, has prevailed.
Mikey Sherrill will be elected the next governor of New Jersey.
The overperformance by both of these Democratic candidates in their states, respective states, is a big signal.
Very high turnout, higher turnout than they've seen in a governor's race here in years.
I don't think you ever need to look very far in our current politics without wondering what the effect of Donald Trump was and is.
President Trump downplayed his role in last night's results, blaming it on the shutdown.
If people voted on lower prices, they got revenge indictments. And if they voted on jobs, they got Doge and a shutdown.
Very big night for Democrats. They had a clean sweep in all the major races they were running in.
History you might remember. Donald Trump lost in 2020 by 4 points nationally. It was a clear rejection by the people. Then some did declare his political career completely over. And that narrative was obviously too sweeping. He did return in 2024 with a comeback, and he won. He won less decisively than Biden in 20. Trump won by 1.5 points amid a tough economy that hurts incumbents. And then we got this other sweeping narrative that popped up. This overstated claim, you've probably heard it from Republicans because it serves their interests, but we've also heard it from the media and from the business community and from others who have all the different reasons that they got there. But this very overstated claim that Trump was now suddenly, after this 1.5 point shift, maybe now he was very popular, or he was the new mainstream, or the people who went his way last year, a year ago this week, were now part of some wider permanent coalition where he was doing better among different groups, including interesting groups that he'd struggled with in the past, younger people, Latinos. All of that hype for this 1.5 point margin a year ago has proven even more overstated, misleading than the other past narratives I mentioned. And sometimes the narratives are wrong against him. Sometimes they're wrong for him. It's why we always try to deal with evidence and numbers on this show and not the sweeping claims. But Trump and his MAGA agenda, we can now say with another election to count, Trump and his MAGA agenda have fared very poorly among the voters in all but one election they've ever ran in the MAGA era. With people living under Trump's second term, there is a, quote, broad dissatisfaction with Trump among all voters who weighed in. That's what the exit shows, the exit polls that sample everybody. It's an electoral result which reinforces something that we've been covering, that Rachel pointed out could be significant from the very beginning, and many journalists on the ground, local reporters. I know it's very popular to attack all of the media all the time these days, but we have all this footage from journalists and citizen reporters and phone videos showing what millions of people are saying, which is no kings in America. If the huge No Kings protests last month were the shot, the New York Times writes, the election was the chaser, with Democrats showing once more that they could turn out to deliver a powerful vote when Mr. Trump is in the White House. That also could affect next year, a prominent forecaster shifting over 10 House races in California alone towards Democrats because of the results, because how Democrats are fighting back to use power. And so consider the impact on a House that Republicans currently hold by only a thread for the reasons I remind you. They haven't had big blowups. They had a 1.5 point margin a year ago. Right now, House Republicans can only afford to actually lose 2 seats. You have that margin of 5, so if you lose 3, you lose the House. Now, much could change in the next year. We don't need another new overstated narrative. Many of the narratives have evaporated quickly, although it seems that the pro-MAGA capitulation narratives are sold by many powerful people with big megaphones more aggressively than the other narratives. So, does what happened last night show a path, possibly, to a very different story than the one we've lived through across this year? A story of public protest, a story where the public will matters, and a story where gerrymandering and redistricting and anti-democratic efforts and troops in the streets are rejected peacefully by the American people?
Happy Wednesday. It's 4 o'clock in New York. A clean sweep. Happy clean sweep. Millions of Americans from sea to shining sea delivering a crystal clear and decisive blow and rebuke to Donald J. Trump, electing Democrats in multiple statewide races by blowout margins in some cases, and approving a ballot measure that puts Democrats in the driver's seat and in position to potentially retake the House in the 2026 midterms, despite Republican efforts to gerrymander the congressional maps. Voters in California came out in stunning numbers, delivering a stinging blow to Trump's efforts to rig the game in his favor, as his political standing continues to sink lower and lower by the day with the American people. Prop 50 passed by double-digit margins. More than 8 million people voted. That number is set to grow as the ballots continue to be counted. Now Democrats could net up to 5 seats, neutralizing the gerrymander by Republicans in Texas that kicked off this nationwide redistricting battle. And in California, where John Heilman pointed out yesterday rather astutely that nothing was on the ballot. No people were on the ballot. No candidate was there driving out the vote. It was just this idea, this thing, Prop 50. Voters came out for that thing in record numbers to send a message to Donald Trump. Here's California's Governor Gavin Newsom.
We're proud of the work that the people of the state of California did tonight to send a powerful message to an historic president. Donald Trump is an historic president. He is the most historically unpopular president in modern history. In every critical category, Donald Trump is underwater. He promised to make us healthier. He promised to make us wealthier. We're sicker and poorer. And he fundamentally understands that. Why else would he call Greg Abbott saying he's entitled to 5 seats? Why else is he trying to rig the midterm elections before one single vote is even cast? He understands his position at this moment in the United States of America. One thing he never counted on, though, was the state of California. Instead of agonizing over the state of our nation, we organized in an unprecedented way in a 90-day sprint. People from all over the United States of America contributed their voices and their support for this initiative. We stood tall and we stood firm in response to Donald Trump's recklessness. And tonight, after poking the bear, this bear roared with an unprecedented turnout in a special election with an extraordinary result.
The margin was so big and the turnout so dramatic that it might be easy to forget or lose sight of the fact that that extraordinary result was far from a sure thing. Politico reports that early polling showed opposition to redrawing the maps ahead of last night, and it seeded doubt among Democrats about whether they would succeed at all. From that report, quote, the outlook was anything but certain back when Democrats were still clinging to the hope that they could bluff their way out of a precarious and costly redistricting arms race. The sobering initial poll was a fork-in-the-road moment for Newsom and his political inner circle. Perhaps some on the team suggested getting voter approval was too heavy of a lift. Nevertheless, they plowed ahead, building up a daunting cash advantage, unifying a bruised party, and galvanizing voters around an anti-Trump message, all in a matter of weeks. Here's more from Governor Gavin Newsom.
As we speak, people are still in line. People waiting up 3 hours to cast their vote, to send a message to Donald Trump. No crowns, no thrones, no kings. Our state of mind was resolute. Our state of mind was resolved to stand firm and to stand tall, to not be intimidated, to not be humiliated, to not fall prey to cynicism, to not fall prey to fear and the anxiety of someone that believes in only one thing, shock and awe, to intimidate and exhaust us. But we're seeing all across this country, 7 million people strong, standing up, not just for themselves, but for each other and for these enduring and historic principles of our founding fathers. And I'll end on that. Next year is the 250th anniversary of the best of Roman Republic, the best of Greek democracy. This fundamental notion of a system of checks and balances, of popular sovereignty, the rule of law. Mr. President, the rule of law, not the rule of dawn. And I hope it's dawning on people, the sobriety of this moment, what's at stake. Tonight, as I said, is an extraordinary moment for our party, but again, it's an extraordinary moment affirming those principles. Our founding fathers did not live and die to see the kind of vandalism to this republic and our democracy that Donald Trump is trying to perpetuate.
The pro-democracy coalition delivering defeat after defeat for Donald Trump and Republicans in ways that will resonate in the months and perhaps years ahead is where we start today. With me at the table, MSNBC's Alicia Menendez. Also joining us, Puck News senior political columnist, MSNBC national affairs analyst John Heilemann, and MSNBC senior national and political correspondent Jacob Sobroff is back with us. Jacob, I started this hour with you and Alicia. You were on those lines with voters at 4 o'clock. I left this set some, 8, 9 hours later. I won't complain, though, because Alicia's shift was longer than mine. And you were still online with those voters. Just tell me the story of Prop 50 last night.
As a matter of fact, Nicole, even after the polls closed and after I left that event where Gavin Newsom gave those remarks that you just played, at 9:15 p.m., an hour and 15 minutes after the polls were closed, that line continued to stretch halfway around the block and people didn't get out of line. I talked to a senior advisor to Governor Gavin Newsom just minutes ago, and obviously they're ecstatic. They're ecstatic by the turnout that you're looking at on the left-hand side of your screen, and what they say is their people, the Democrats, stayed till the end of the game. Trump scared his voters away, and they left at halftime, particularly as it relates to Latino voters. And if you look at places like Imperial County, the flip between, and that's a largely Latino county on the border with Mexico here in California, the flip between Kamala Harris voters and Prop 50 voters is one that is giving them a huge, enormous amount of encouragement. And, you heard Gavin Newsom say this was a 90-day campaign. Remember where it started. It started in Little Tokyo in downtown Los Angeles, where Greg Bovino showed up outside of Gavin Newsom's rally, the head of the patrol division of the Border Patrol, in tactical gear, in order to terrorize, intimidate, and scare away pretty much a who's who of California politicians from announcing this initiative. Of course, that's not what they say they were doing, but Gavin Newsom says that's exactly what they were doing, and it had the opposite effect. Latinos turned out. Democrats turned out. I've never seen an off-year election in my 10-plus years at MSNBC that felt like the way yesterday did here in California.
Let me ask you a question about the temptation to separate out, even for today's newscast, right? We're going to talk in the next block about the ICE video that Gavin Newsom's office sent you while you were online covering Prop 50. Maybe we disaggregate these things at our own peril. I mean, if you look at Trump's numbers on immigration, California voters by margins of 64% to 12% think that Trump's actions on immigration have gone too far. 7 million people turned out in the country for No Kings rallies. Prop 50 passed. I think 2-1 is the best way to describe its margin. But importantly, Republicans sort of gave up. They stopped trying to raise money. They stopped trying to turn out the vote. And Newsom himself said, we have enough money for our side. Don't send any more money. What is it that voters are experiencing that tie all these things together? Trump's overreach, the rigging of the maps, and what we're seeing with our own eyes in terms of the ICE violence really being carried out in communities.
Even after January 6th, even after the first Trump presidency, when I would walk on lines in places all around the country in all of the swing states, democracy was never, ever the first thing that people brought up. Words like freedom, words like, standing up for my children and our future in this country. People would talk about the economy. People would talk about the local kitchen table, pocketbook issues everywhere I go. It's why we would do that series, What Matters, that we did here election after election, because despite the things that we would talk about, despite the things that people in Washington and New York and maybe sometimes here in L.A. would say were sort of the big picture intellectual issues, the fading of democracy, the rise of autocracy, that's not what people would talk about. That is what people were talking about last night on the line outside of the California Museum, across the street from the office of Governor Gavin Newsom in the state capital of Sacramento. And according to David Noriega, my colleague who was here in Los Angeles, and other reports all through California, that's what was front of mind for everybody. Everybody felt like their hold on their lives in an existential way was slipping away because of what we have seen, not just on the streets here in Los Angeles, but what I've seen myself in Chicago, what we've seen in Portland, all of those cities that Gavin Newsom brought up last night. When all of that started here in the summer of 2025, all of the politicians here were saying this is a petri dish. Karen Bass, in particular, the mayor of Los Angeles. What is happening on these streets is not just about immigration. It is about the president of the United States taking power away from you and your life and your ability to live and make decisions for yourself. And I think I've never seen so many young people in line the way that they were. Everybody's got the ability, if you're a registered voter, to have a mail-in ballot, yet so many people showed up to hang out, to talk to each other, to eat pizza, and in their own words, stand up for the future of the American democratic project last night.